7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys. A household staff large enough to run a regional economy. Gone in a single day. The book of Job opens with the most complete financial collapse in all of Scripture. And for 3,000 years, we have read it almost entirely as a story about suffering and faith, which it is. But there is another layer inside that text, one that modern portfolio theory has been quietly rediscovering since the 1950s. Job's story is the oldest documented case study in total drawdown, in sequence of returns risk, in what it actually costs to recover from a complete loss, and in what the doubling at the end, the part everyone quotes, actually tells us about how recovery works. Stay with us, because the last section of this teaching is the one that will change how you think about risk forever. The text does not open with Job's faith. It opens with Job's balance sheet. Job 1:3 calls him the greatest of all the people of the East. That is not a spiritual designation. That is an economic ranking. The writer wants you to understand what Job had before you understand what Job lost. Let us read that inventory seriously. 7,000 sheep, that is, wool production, meat supply, and liquid asset in one. In the ancient Near East, sheep were a form of currency. 3,000 camels. These were not transportation for personal use. Camels were the long-haul freight network of the ancient world. Owning 3,000 of them is the equivalent of owning a regional logistics company. 500 yoke of oxen, agricultural production capacity at scale. 500 donkeys, short-haul distribution. And then the text adds, a very great household, which in context means a trained workforce capable of managing all of it. Here is what a modern portfolio analyst would notice immediately. Job was diversified. Different asset classes, different income streams, agricultural production, transportation infrastructure, livestock as liquid wealth. He was not a one-asset man. And yet, every single position went to zero on the same day. This is the first financial lesson in the book of Job, and it is one that modern investors learned the hard way in 2008, in 2020, and in every correlated market crash since. Diversification across asset classes does not protect you when the correlation between those assets goes to 1. When a systemic event hits, everything moves together. Job's sheep, camels, oxen, and donkeys were diversified in normal conditions. In a catastrophic event, they were one position. Comment below. Have you ever thought you were diversified only to watch everything fall at the same time? Drop a 1 if yes. I want to know how many of us have been there. The losses in Job 1 do not arrive all at once. They arrive sequentially. 4 messengers, 4 separate blows, and the text is careful to tell us that each messenger arrived while the previous one was still speaking. That sequence matters more than most readers realize. Modern financial research, particularly the work done around retirement planning since the 1990s, has given us a name for this: sequence of returns risk. The idea is this: the order in which losses occur is not neutral. It is not just the total magnitude of a loss that determines your ability to recover. It is when that loss happens relative to your position in the accumulation or distribution cycle. Here is why this matters practically. 2 investors can experience the same total percentage loss over the same 10-year period and arrive at completely different ending balances, simply because one took the large losses early and the other took them late. The investor who loses heavily in year 1 has a smaller base compounding through the recovery years. The investor who loses in year 9 has already compounded a larger base through the growth years, and has less time remaining for the loss to matter. Job lost everything before he had time to compound anything from a recovered position. He was not in a slow decline. He was in a single-session wipeout followed by a second blow, his health, that prevented him from immediately rebuilding. This is the cruelest version of sequence risk, not just early losses followed by an extended period in which you cannot deploy capital even if opportunity presents itself. There is a workbook that walks through the full biblical framework for structuring a household against this kind of sequence exposure, day by day, week by week. It is linked in the description below. I will come back to it once, later. Now, back to the text. Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar. 3 men who travel a great distance to sit with their friend in his loss. And for 7 days they say nothing, which is, honestly, the wisest thing they do in the entire book. Then they start talking, and what they say, dressed in beautiful poetry, delivered with genuine conviction, is the oldest and most persistent financial myth in human history. You are in this position because of something you did wrong. Your loss is a signal of your character. Recover your character, and the wealth will return. We do not have to work hard to find this framework in modern financial culture. It shows up every time someone implies that financial hardship is primarily a discipline problem. That if you had simply budgeted better, invested earlier, spent less, the loss would not have happened. Some of that is sometimes true, but Job's friends make the error of turning a partial truth into a total explanation. God's response to the 3 friends in Job 38 through 41 is essentially a 40-chapter argument that the universe is more complex than their framework allows. That loss is not always a ledger entry against character. That some risks materialize regardless of how wisely you managed them. This is not a license for recklessness. Job was not reckless. The text is explicit. He was blameless and upright. His losses were not the result of poor stewardship. They were the result of systemic exposure to risks that no individual stewardship decision could have prevented. If you have ever blamed yourself for a financial loss that was genuinely outside your control, a job elimination, a medical crisis, a market event, I want you to hear this from 3,000 years of Scripture. The 3 friends were wrong, and God said so directly. If that landed somewhere real for you, you know what to do with that like button. Here is what the text records Job doing in the immediate aftermath of total loss. He tore his robe. He shaved his head. He fell to the ground, and he worshipped. Then he said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Job 1:21. And then the text adds something remarkable. In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. From a behavioral finance perspective, what Job does not do is as significant as what he does. He does not panic sell. There is nothing left to sell but the behavioral impulse to do something, to respond to loss with frantic action, is precisely what destroys recovery in most portfolio wipeouts. The research on investor behavior during market downturns consistently shows that the investors who fare worst are not the ones who held the riskiest assets. They are the ones who sold at the bottom and locked in permanent losses by exiting before the recovery. Job sits in the ash. He does not flee the position. He does not make a desperate decision in the middle of the worst moment. He holds. He also does not catastrophize permanently. His language in chapter 1 is grief language, not despair language. He acknowledges what was given. He acknowledges it was taken. He does not conclude that because it was taken, it can never return. This is the behavioral posture that makes recovery possible, the ability to sit in the loss without either denying it or being destroyed by it. Most of us have never been tested at Job's level, but we have all faced moments where the impulse to do something, anything, in the middle of a financial crisis felt overwhelming. Comment below, what is the hardest financial moment you have ever had to simply sit in and wait through? I read every one of these. After the three friends finish their speeches, and after God corrects them publicly, something shifts in the narrative. Job 42:11 records what happens next, and it is easy to read past it. Then came to him all his brothers and sisters, and all who had known him before, and ate bread with him in his house. And they showed him sympathy and comforted him for all the evil that the Lord had brought upon him. And each of them gave him a piece of silver and a ring of gold. Read that again. They gave him capital, not advice, not a theological framework, not a speech about what he should have done differently. They brought silver and gold, liquid assets, and they placed them in his hands. This is the first external capital infusion in Job's recovery, and it comes not from a market recovery, not from a business strategy, but from a community network that had been built over a lifetime of right relationship. This is something the financial planning literature has started to name more carefully in recent years. Social capital. The network of relationships that can provide both support and actual resources in a crisis. Job had built this network not as a financial strategy, but as a way of living. The text tells us earlier that he was a man who interceded for his children, who offered sacrifices on their behalf, who was known throughout the region for his integrity. His social capital was a function of his character, and in the moment of total financial loss, that social capital became the seed capital for his recovery. Here is the question worth sitting with. If your financial position went to zero tomorrow, what network exists around you that would show up with silver and gold? Not because they owed you, but because of who you have been to them. This is the part of the text that most financial applications of Job skip entirely. The recovery did not begin with Job's own effort. It began with community. That order matters. Job 42:10 records that God restored Job's fortunes and gave him twice as much as he had before. 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, 1,000 donkeys, and 10 more children. This is the verse that prosperity gospel teaching reaches for first, the doubling, the restoration, the proof that faithfulness produces financial return. We need to be careful here and honest about what the text actually says and does not say. First, what the text does say. The restoration is real. The doubling is real. Job ends the book wealthier than he began it. This is not a metaphor. The writer intends us to understand that Job's material situation was genuinely restored and exceeded. Second, what the text does not say. It does not say this happened quickly. Job 42 does not give us a timeline. The rabbinical tradition and various commentators have suggested the restoration took years, possibly decades. The text is silent on the mechanism and the duration. Anyone who tells you Job got it all back in a season is reading something into the text that is not there. Third, and this is the financial insight that almost nobody names, the doubling is not a return on a position, it is a new position built on a cleared foundation. Job does not recover his original assets, he builds new ones. The sheep that were killed are not resurrected, new flocks are established. This is the difference between recovery and rebuilding. Recovery implies returning to what was. Rebuilding means starting the compounding clock again from a new base. This is actually the more encouraging financial reality for anyone who has experienced a genuine wipeout. You are not trying to recover a position that no longer exists. You are building a new one. The question is not, how do I get back to where I was? The question is, what is the right base to build from now? What I just walked you through, the inventory, the behavioral posture, the community capital, the rebuilding framework, is 1 week of a 30-day version in the workbook linked below. The full resource includes the household inventory worksheet, the reserve architecture, and the 4-week structure that takes you from assessment to a 1-page household operating system. It is in the description. That is the only time I will point at it directly. If this teaching has been working something loose in how you think about risk and recovery, if the Job framework is landing differently than you expected, then you are exactly the kind of person who benefits from going deeper rather than staying at the surface level. Subscribe right now, because this is what we do every week. Read the text carefully, take it seriously as financial wisdom, and refuse to flatten it into either a prosperity promise or a guilt trip. 1 click, and then let us get to the part of this teaching that I think matters most. We cannot end this teaching without addressing the landmine directly. Someone watching this will hear everything we have said about Job's restoration and conclude, if I have enough faith, if I manage my losses with the right posture, if I build the right community, God will double my portfolio too. That is not what the text teaches. And it is important to say that clearly, because the prosperity gospel reading of Job is one of the most spiritually and financially damaging misreadings in popular Christian culture. Here is what the book of Job actually establishes about the relationship between faith and financial outcome. Job's 3 friends, the ones who argued that righteousness produces prosperity and loss signals sin, were wrong. God said so, explicitly. In Job 42:7, God tells Eliphaz, "My anger burns against you and against your 2 friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has." The prosperity gospel framework is not a biblical framework. It is the framework of Job's friends, and God rebuked it. What Job's story does establish is this: a person of integrity facing total loss who maintains honest relationship with God, including honest argument and lament, which Job does extensively, is not abandoned. The restoration in Job is not a transaction. It is not faith exchanged for financial return. It is the culmination of a relationship that was never primarily about the assets in the first place. The financial principles inside Job's story, diversification and its limits, sequence of returns risk, behavioral discipline in a drawdown, the role of community capital, the difference between recovery and rebuilding. These are real and applicable. They are embedded in the text because the text was written about real human experience in a real economy. But the text does not promise that applying these principles produces a specific financial outcome. It promises something different and, I would argue, more durable. That the person who builds their household on integrity rather than on the size of their position is building something that a single catastrophic event cannot permanently destroy. That is not a prosperity promise. It is better than one. Here is your challenge for this week. Take 1 hour and write down your actual household inventory, every income stream, every obligation, every asset. Not to optimize it yet, just to see it clearly. Comment the word rebuild below if you are committing to that this week. I will be reading every comment, and I will be praying specifically for every person who responds. If you have made it this far, you already understand something that most financial content never touches: the difference between a framework that tells you what to want and a framework that helps you understand what you actually have and what it can withstand. That is what we build here, week after week. If this is the first time you have found us, subscribe, because next week we go somewhere in Scripture that I think will surprise you. And if this teaching helped clarify something you have been carrying, the workbook in the description below takes the full framework further than a single video can. 94 pages, 30 days, the complete household system. It is there if you want it. Job did not get his old life back. He built a new one, on the same ground, with the same character, and a clearer understanding of what the assets were never really for. Thanks for watching. The end screen has more in the same world. Pick whichever one calls to you. Thanks for being here. Everything on the end screen comes from the same place this teaching did.